Hey everyone, this is Shane from Starner's Woodworking, and in this video we make a couple mistakes, learn some new tricks, and in the end make a pretty beautiful table, so stick around. So I'm starting off with these two walnut live edge slabs. They're 8 foot long and I'd say roughly 18 to 20 inches wide. I actually got these slabs from a local sawmill around me, and this was my first time going to this one in particular, and I have to say I'm super impressed. So I called this guy up and told him what I wanted, basically 2 slabs wide enough to join together and build a live edge table. So he had the log sawed up and sent some pictures over, and then had the slabs in the kiln within less than 2 hours of me calling him, and honestly that's pretty impressive. Then 2 weeks later they were dry and ready to go, and then he actually had them sent off to be planed, which I think was only around 50 more cents a board foot, which came out to maybe $30 extra. And for the time that I would have to put into these slabs to get them flat, that was well worth it. Anyways, I'm using my makeshift track saw here to get a jointed edge. And as you can see, basically for my fence, I'm just using a 4-inch wide piece of steel, and it is dead straight. It is just as straight as a Festool track saw track or anything like that. The only difference here between my setup and an actual track saw is the fact that my setup will definitely leave some blade marks that have to be cleaned up in order to get a nice clean joint. So since I don't own a nice industrial joiner just quite yet, I'm using the next best thing, which is a hand planer. And I'm just only doing 3 to 4 passes here at a 32nd of an inch just to make sure I get all those blade marks off. Next, I'm measuring out my rough length, and you can see I have that piece laid out, and I will actually trace both sides, the inner side being the final dimensions and the outer side being the rough dimensions that I'm going to trim to at the moment. And the reason I'm doing this now instead of after the fact I have it glued up is because there's just less surface there that I have to glue up, and there's just less possibility of a gap forming or something going wrong. It might be a little more extra work and maybe not make sense to you, honestly, but that's what made sense to me at this time, so that's what I went with. Here I have my trusty dowel drilling guide, and this just goes to show that you don't need a fancy Festool domino jig. While yes, it may take a little bit extra time, it surely is a fraction of the cost of one of those things. Now this right here is a very important step, and it's just test fitting everything before you get glue on there to make sure everything fits. The last thing you want to do is get glue on your boards and then realize something doesn't fit just quite right together. This is actually a pretty cool tip that I learned. So clamps give off pressure at 45 degrees, and you can see how I have this visualized here. So as long as your angles here intersect just before the glue joint, your clamps are spaced just good enough to where there's even pressure along the whole joint. Now this is where having a second man in the shop would definitely really come in handy. I was really stressing that I was running out of time to get this thing glued together before it's set up, and I can say I was sweating once I finished this thing. Honestly, it's pretty crazy to me what one man can do when the pressure is on. Anyways, I'm using some of these little scrap pieces I have between the clamps just to make sure I protect that live edge and don't damage it or put any clamp marks on it. After that dry, I came back the next day and I just wanted to sand that joint real quick just to make sure there was no gaps and it was good and ready to go. So I actually picked up this new sandpaper, and I'm definitely not sponsored by them, but I have to say it is the best sandpaper I've ever used. Compared to the Amazon variety pack that I usually use, it just rips through everything and leaves such a nice finish. Anyways, you can see here my pause and look of disappointment as I realize the gap is super ugly and definitely not up to my standard. So I ripped it back down with my saw and re-glued it together, and it was fixed, right? Wrong. So I'm not going to show it all on video, but I actually had to re-glue this board 4 different times, and man, was I ever annoyed. Yes, it took me 4 whole glue ups to realize what I was doing wrong, and just to take my time and be patient and make sure it's right until I glue it back up. This just goes to show we all make mistakes. And I'm not going to be the one to edit out my mistakes of this video and hide them and act like I'm perfect, because I'm not, and neither is any other woodworker on YouTube. But I overcame it and got it just perfect, and I'm so glad that I did. Next, I'm assembling the base, and I actually got this off of Etsy. And you can see the instructions here, and they definitely weren't the best. And it says, recommending 2 people for assembly, which again, would be nice to have that second person. But we made it work. And just like that, we ran into another problem. So for some reason, no matter which way I switched these posts back and forth, there was always a hole that didn't line up with the threads. So here you can see it's off just a tad, but just enough to make the bolt not fit. So I just got a cone metal bit and drilled out the hole just to make it a tad wider, and that seemed to do the trick. Hey, look at that. Here's another time where I could use a second hand in the shop. But you can see me struggle to get this on top of the base, but yet alone I get it done. If you're enjoying the video so far, I would really appreciate if you go ahead and leave a like on the video. And if you're not enjoying the video, well, you must be, because you're still here watching. Anyways, back to the video. Here I'm just preparing this knot for some epoxy. I'm just making sure I get all the little pieces of dust and loose bark out before I fill it. A quick tip for epoxy that some of you may not know is that you should actually try to heat it up before you use it. And the reason for this is it just allows it to flow a lot better and get in all those cracks and limit the bubbles. As you can see there, I used my kerosene heater to heat it up a little bit, and I would definitely not recommend taking an eye off this thing. Just checking to make sure that nothing goes wrong, and don't leave it under the heat for too long, as it could damage the epoxy too. So I'm going back and finding all the cracks on the top and just filling it with a little bit of black epoxy here. And as you can see, this satisfying bubble pop with the torch. Once that epoxy hardened overnight, it was finally time to start doing some final work. So here I am trimming the table down to the final dimension, which actually ended up being 7 foot long. And man, you can see my enthusiasm as I prepare to start sanding, because man, this is a tedious process, but this is one thing that you don't want to skimp on. Sanding can definitely make or break your project, and is something that you want to take your time, work up through the grits, and just do it right. And another thing, to my amazement, after I sanded this whole top with this 80 grit sandpaper, this is how it looks. Honestly, you can barely even tell it was ever used. Another reason why it is so impressive and I like it so much. Well, it's time to dangerously flip this table for probably the first time out of 3 or 4 times. But anyways, we're going to get this sanded down. I'm not going to bore you with more sanding, but now we're going to get the table base attached using threaded inserts. So now I'm trying to find the center of this table in order to attach the base. And with a live edge table, it's definitely not exactly easy to get the center due to the nature of the live edge, but you just have to make do with what you have. I'm sure we all have drilled through a tabletop at least once, and I'm definitely guilty of it. So I'm doing my best here to make sure that doesn't happen. And even though it's a thick table and it would be pretty hard to drill through the top, I am taking no chances. Before I attach my threaded inserts, I just add a little dab of glue in the holes. And they're really probably not going anywhere without the glue, but it just gives me a little bit of peace of mind that they are surely not going anywhere. So these bolts that I'm using are actually a brass finish, and I was originally planning to spray paint them black, but I actually really liked the contrast between them and the base. But let me know what you guys think. There were actually a couple of pieces underneath here that needed to be fixed, and instead of using epoxy, I decided to go with some glue mixed with some fine sawdust powder from my sander. Basically, you want to go ahead and get this real thick paste mixture and make sure you're using the same species of wood that you are working on. As you can see here, it's a little bit lighter, but as you can see now, it actually is a little bit darker. And once you sand it away, the gap is honestly really seamless and you can barely even tell. Well, it's time for more sanding, but I can finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. And like I said earlier in the video, this is a part that you don't want to skimp out on. Between each grit, I just gave it a nice light spray down with some water here, and this just raises the grain to help give it a nicer finish and sand a little better. But you want to make sure that the board is completely dry before you start into the next grit. Alright, yes, I know, I'm sure you guys are probably getting tired of watching me sand, but it is a really important part of the process. Instead of doing a round over here, I actually grabbed some sandpaper and a sanding block and just gave it the slightest little chamfer, and I thought that added a really nice clean touch to the table. Another little tip here before you get ready to finish is grab a flashlight, turn all the lights off, and really closely just examine the whole table. Look for any little flaws or swirl marks or little imperfections just before you finish. So what would be a live edge table on YouTube without finishing it with Rubio Monocoat? And honestly, I can't really bash on it too much as it is such a great finish. I'm not going to go too in depth with the finishing process, but basically you just want to spread it all on, buff it in, let it sit for maybe about 15 minutes and wipe it completely off. If you want to know more, I'm planning to do a full in-depth video of how to apply Rubio Monocoat, so be on the lookout for that video. After that, it's pretty much all done. So it's time to take some pictures. And as you can see, I'm using some black tablecloths here, which it isn't the best setup, but it definitely got the job done for me. If you're trying to sell your products, I think taking good pictures is definitely essential. It just gives it such a more professional look. And as you can see here, these are some pictures that I came out with. And yes, they're not perfect, but it's definitely something I'm working on, and I still am so happy with how the table turned out. Thank you so much for making it to the end of the video, and I want you to start your comment with how much you would pay for a table like this. I'm really curious to see what you guys think, and I will be pinning the closest comment to what it actually sold for. Anyways, I'll see you in the next video.